Arjun, we'll still need you to stay on stage because, of course, I'd like to start with our next speaker panel. And this is going to be India's Look East policy, which will touch on India's response to Asia's growth opportunities. And I'd like to invite onto the stage the other speakers on this panel. First off, we have Mr. Akhil Kumar, and he is from GS Caltex, which is a leading energy player in Asia with operations upstream, refining market, petrochemicals, lubricants, and power generation. Next, we have Mr. Ashwini Kakkar. He's the Executive Vice Chairman and Director of Mercury Travels. He's been the President of the Travel Agents Association of India since 2005. And Mr. Ravi Uppal, the Managing Director and CEO of Navin Jindal Group as well, who brings with him more than 36 years of experience in working in engineering and infrastructure segments. And finally, Mr. Guneet Chadha, the Chair and Co-CEO of Deutsche Bank, who has over 2 decades of retail, corporate, and investment banking experience. So, gentlemen, please have a wonderful session.
Okay, let me kick off this panel with a topic which is very dear to my heart. It's something which I've often discussed with several entrepreneurs in India as to why the preoccupation with looking west when the West is looking east. Delighted with the panelists right here. Let me set the stage, if I may, around some broad themes of why Asia. Certainly, a region which is going to control half the GDP of the world over the next 20 years. And I believe 4 of the top 10 countries are going to be in this time zone, right? China, India, Japan, Indonesia. A region which already has close to $100 billion of trade between India and ASEAN, and another 100 billion getting to that number between India and China. So that's a huge trade corridor of $200 billion. A region which, as a consumption base, will probably, by various estimates, have another 2.5 billion people coming into the middle class by 2030, which is probably 2/3 of the global middle class. A region which, with the dominance of China and Singapore as capital centers, could probably become the capital provider to the world and certainly to Asia. And I know some of my colleagues sitting on my table are part of that. And certainly already controls 1/4 of the world's financial assets and half the world's reserves. A region which certainly has a huge urbanization theme. And by many a reckoning, about 50 million people are going to move from rural to urban areas every year, year on year, for the next decade. And that's transformational in terms of spending power. And yet a region which has challenges which are common in many respects: energy security, water, food inflation, and may I say some wage inflation, which is going to narrow the gap between the West and the East in terms of labor costs. So with that as the stage, we thought it would be a good idea to probably put to each of our panelists, a very illustrious panel right here, some thematic questions. And let me start with you, Akhil. You have spent many a decade in probably which is the most pressing problem in the region, which is energy security. What are some of the collaboration work which Asia can do together, and India being certainly right in the center of that? And equally, your thoughts working for a multinational in India now, what are some of your recommendations in terms of Indian companies which want to go out into Asia, set up joint ventures, and what kind of governance frameworks you would suggest for them? So let's start with your sector and then broad-base that.
Thank you, Guneet. Let me just kind of lay down where are we in terms of energy. The world petroleum consumption is about 86 million barrels per day. Of that, Asia is consuming about 30%. Asia as a group has overtaken US and North America in terms of energy consumption. So it's the single largest block which consumes energy. And that's why, the growth of Asia is really intertwined with the energy security. And where does Asia get its energy from? Primarily, 80% is from Middle East. So as United States becomes more and more self-reliant on energy through natural gas, shale oil, and it is expected that in about 10 years' time, United States could be, in fact, an exporter of energy. The Middle East energy primarily will be targeted towards Asia. I mean, that's where the Middle East oil would start flowing. That is a good thing, but it also puts the supply chain at a big risk that there's only one primary source for Asia. So what can Asia do to reduce its reliance or diversify? And some of the things which have been done in the United States are possible, and countries are looking at it, like the shale gas and shale oil. And China is supposed to have significant resources. India has some, but there are significant issues and problems which need to be worked through. Capital obviously is one, technology is another, and there are some environmental, in fact, huge environmental concerns in that, and it's not very clear how will all that play out. So how does then Asia look at diversifying its resources? Some of the things it needs to be looking at, and there's some of the things that are already underway, is look at more cleaner fuels like LNG from Australia, and also some of that will also come out of North America. And as Asia starts exploring its own backyard in India and China and elsewhere, the issues of technology, issues of capital would be or should be addressed or are being addressed through primarily joint ventures, because enough technology is not just available right now. And so you see, and will continue to see, more and more initiatives and joint ventures, like, for example, in India you see Reliance BP joint venture. Reliance is getting the technology and some capital from BP, and there is a sharing of risk. And you will see more and more of these ventures coming in. And I see in the future, in the next 10 years to 15 years, as Asia will drop its reliance on Middle East oil, and it will not completely disappear for sure, as long as the price of oil is within reasonable levels. But 20 to 30% of its energy needs would be coming through some of its own sources and from Australia, North America, and so on. Now, talking about, and I'm shifting gears a little bit, about these joint ventures in oil and energy, and I gave example of Reliance and BP. It's a huge challenge to put these kind of joint ventures together. I've been associated with GS Caltex, which is considered one of the most successful joint ventures and has been around for 45 years and one of the largest. And I was also associated with another joint venture, Chevron Reliance, which didn't have a very long life, a lot of expectations, and it didn't work out. So the success rate of my association is about 50%. And believe it or not, that is the success rate of most joint ventures. 50% of the joint ventures flop in about 2 to 3 years' time. So how do we, going forward, make sure that these joint ventures, which are quite important for this part of the world, and not just in energy, but other businesses as well, get on the right footing and create value, what we are looking for. If you look at, in India particularly, some of the well-known joint ventures like Maruti Suzuki, L&T Komatsu, Bharati Walmart, Tata Docomo, they seem to have done reasonably well or are expected to do well. But there have been others which have almost disappeared. Hero Honda, TVS, Suzuki. There is another one recently which was Tata Starbucks. So there are all these joint ventures coming in oil business, other businesses. And the reasons for setting up these joint ventures are fairly obvious. The joint venture partner needs some local expertise, maybe local know-how, local skills. And the joint venture, the other partner is bringing in technology and maybe some capital. A few things which need to be kept in mind while looking at these joint ventures is the alignment of the partner strategy is absolutely the key. The partners need to be very clear in terms of what are their focus on, market shares versus profitability, dividend issues. Another factor which is very important for this part of the world is the cultural issues. Understanding from the partner what exactly is the things which are important to the partner, and these, if they are deferred to a later date, comes back to haunt the JV. Building trust is another thing which is extremely critical, and breach of trust is like a cancer, which eventually the JV implodes because of that. And putting in proper governance issues and creates the right confidence and the transparencies in the joint venture, which helps in the survival of the joint venture and prospering of the joint venture in the long run. So to sum it up, the joint ventures route has huge challenges, but also it has fairly big rewards, because the other route of going through M&A is definitely much more expensive. JV, you could start and create more value. And I see in energy field particularly, more and more such joint ventures where the ticket items are pretty big, we'll come to see more and more of those being formed to help in the energy issues. So
Thanks, Akhil. Thanks. Let me turn the needle on that. While you spoke about many of the Asian companies looking into India, Ashwini, you've sort of the professional turned entrepreneur. Any anecdotal evidences of Indian companies looking east? And equally, what's the opportunity for India to tap into the large consumption base in the services sector across Asia?
Well, let me start by giving you some little anecdotal evidence. For example, 300 years ago, when the East India Company started, 50% of the world GDP was controlled by India and China. And the world trade was also a very large proportion controlled by India and China. Now, clearly that pendulum is swinging back. Not that it will reach the same level, but at least it's in the broad direction. And today, I think a very large portion, maybe 17% of world GDP is still controlled by India and China. Now, over the past few years, India has had this policy of not looking east, but looking more west. And that has historical roots. Why has India traditionally looked west? Well, partly because of a bit of colonization. If you look at, for example, Alexander the Great, from that time onwards, the Dutch were there, the Portuguese, the French, the British, and so on and so forth. So, there's been some of that. There's been the Indian elite in the, let's say, the management of the country, who've all been educated in Western institutions. So there's been a general drift in the westward direction. But from 1991 onwards, this look east policy, which was then formulated by Prime Minister Rao, was diligently followed by Prime Minister Vajpayee and obviously currently continued by Prime Minister Singh. And interestingly, the mentor minister, Lee Kuan Yew, was mainly responsible for this whole initial FTA discussion between the ASEAN countries, Singapore and India, which resulted in this larger look east policy. Now, if you look at what's happening on the ground with this look east policy, beyond what the governments do and so on and so forth, and I'll come to what the governments are doing. But if you look on the ground, Mahindra & Mahindra acquired this large SUV producer in Korea for $463 million. If you look at the joint venture between JLR, which is Jaguar Land Rover, and Chery Automobiles for addressing the markets, and that whole enterprise started near Shanghai. And if you look at the Indian investment, for example, from Godrej into a huge Indonesian fast-moving consumer goods enterprise for almost $300 million, and reverse the direction, and you see Japan having a good experience with a slew of enterprises. Suzuki had a good experience, Toyota's having a good experience, small high-tech companies like Fanuc having a great experience in India, and the chaebols from Korea, Samsung, Hyundai, if you look at LG, a lot of them having fabulous experiences. I think this whole thing has started to gain momentum, if you will. And if you look at the next 3-year horizon, not a very long horizon, but if you look at the 3-year horizon, like Guneet said, the trade between India and ASEAN, $100 billion. The trade between India and China, $100 billion. If you look at, for example, the investments, China is likely to have 350 companies having invested in India in the next 3 years. I mean, they're moving up from the current about 90 or something like that. And India is likely to have 250 companies invested in China. So this is a very interesting melange that's going on. And if you look at, for example, funding, in 3 years, India will have 600 technology startups every year, of which it is expected that 100 are going to be funded out of the East. Singapore, Hong Kong, a lot of these, even from China and so on. So a lot of these investments are going to come from there. And not only small investments, but very large investments are likely to come from these centers. And if you look at, the infrastructural experiments that are going on, as Dr. Rajan said, the Delhi-Mumbai industrial corridor is going to be a massive, massive investment. I mean, the physical governmental investment of Japan is only $4.5 billion. But the impact of that investment, along with the Indian side investment, of course, is going to be $90 billion. And that is going to lead to huge infrastructural changes, and is clearly a case of, collaboration between the two sides. Now, at government level, macro and micro, what's going on at that level? I mean, India has built some very interesting arrangements, the comprehensive economic partnership agreements between Japan and Korea. And then you have the SICA with Singapore. And then, of course, the ASEAN free trade agreement. And a lot of these things which are being put into place to make sure that the Look East policy really has teeth. And if you look at what's the likely scenario, like Guneet said, in 2030, there's India's GDP will probably be between 4 and 5 times of what it is now. There'll be 600 million urban people. There'll be 100 million households. And if you look at in the context of the United States today, United States has 70 million households in the middle income group. And in a few years, there might be 100 million only in India and an equal number, more or less, in China and so on. Now, 68 cities with a population greater than 1 million. That is huge. Even today, if you were to rank Frankfurt as an Indian city, that would probably be the 61st Indian city in terms of population. So, this gives you a relative idea of scale. But what does this mean? This means that India will need 1 billion square meters of new construction in residence and commercial, or 2.5 billion square meters of new roads to be constructed. So who's going to do it? Where is the funding going to come from? And I think the South-South dialogue, the Look East policy, a lot of these things are bringing all this into relative focus. And if this is the macro picture, at the micro level, the small and medium enterprises which are working in China and India are more likely to look at ASEAN for their business. And why so? Because these are tech-smart people. I mean, look at Singapore, for example. There's loads of people with smartphones. I mean, the number of internet users, and these are higher paying people than the population, let's say, at the lower end of India and China. But the Indian story about inclusive growth, the Indian story about bottom of the pyramid, these things are likely to get regionalized all over Asia. Some new things are happening, and these stories are going to get regionalized. And the last point I want to make is that this whole region is conceptually moving from, looking at time. So, and from there moving on to looking at money. And what does this mean? That, it is going to get, there is a polarization happening between cash-rich, time-poor customers and time-rich, cash-poor customers. And this whole region is moving from the time-rich, cash-poor customers segment to the cash-rich, time-poor customer segment. And that's going to have serious implications for the services sector. Whether it's healthcare, whether it's education, whether it's tourism, a lot of these things are going to be affected by this great big trend that we see coming in the future. Thank you.
I think you would agree that we should have Ashwini nominated as the Minister of External Affairs for India, Raghu. Leave that as a thought with you. But that was a very compelling case as to the opportunity which India holds for the rest of Asia. Let's connect the dot from the energy to the services sector to the manufacturing sector. And another global Indian who's moved from being a professional manager to now coming into an Indian company. Interestingly, Ravi, India has probably the best of both. It has state-run companies, which are equivalent to what Singapore has, China has, Malaysia has, SOEs. It has entrepreneurs similar to Indonesia, Thailand, Philippines. And as you see, as a deep into the core manufacturing sector in the country, how can Asia and India come together?
Thank you, Guneet. First, I'd like to say that globally, 70% of the trade is done with manufactured goods, minerals. And as you know, that in the recent years, a lot of manufacturing has got relocated to Asia because Europe is finding that it's not competitive anymore. So I think for Asia as a continent, it's a lifetime opportunity for them to position themselves within the manufacturing sector. It's also known that in Asia, we make up nearly 50% of the global population. The middle class, as was pointed out earlier, is increasing very rapidly. Therefore, the manufacturing sector has a very, very bright future. In India, I would like to develop a minute on the Indian manufacturing sector. Unfortunately, in India, the manufacturing sector has not got a kind of role in the total economy as it is in the other countries. Our total share in the GDP is about 18% if you exclude construction, but if you take construction into it, it's about 25%. Of course, now Government of India in the 12th plan has described this ambition that they want this to grow up to 25%, but it's going to be a long way. In comparison to that, if you look at the other Southeast Asian countries, ASEAN and the other Asian countries, Korea and Japan put together, the share of industrial output is anywhere between 30 to 40%, and even higher in some cases. So, it's very clear that in India we have a long way to go when it comes to manufacturing. A lot of steps have been taken. In India, it was pointed out by Dr. Rajan in the morning that anything that we do, we've got to keep in mind the affordability of anything that we produce. Therefore, bottom of the pyramid is very important. Many products that we bring from outside, from West or developed countries and East, they don't find much of a demand because we are not able to address the issue of affordability. But on the other hand, anything which has targeted the affordable segment, they have been a great success. India, as the manufacturing is growing, our infrastructure is growing, we are going through something what we call as growing pains. I think, many times when we take an outside-in view of India, we feel very frustrated. Things don't move at the speed as it does in China. The projects get stalled. The policies remain undefined. But we have to remember that in India, we were growing at a rate not more than 5 to 6% for several decades. It's only in the last 10 years that we have come anywhere close to achieving 8 to 9%. But there again, we have run into hiccups. I'll give you an example of the power sector, which is so much talked about in India. That up to the 9th plan, or even 10th plan, I would say, we were never adding more than 4 to 5,000 megawatt of capacity. And so that was a steady thing. But here comes the 11th plan, where we added something like 56,000 megawatt, which on an annualized basis was about 11 to 12,000 megawatt. So this was a quantum leap. Many issues came to surface that we never thought about, we never talked about. Coal became scarce, land became a big issue, water became scarce. So, it's not that we get discouraged by it. Now we have got a problem on hand, we need to address it. And I can assure you that even if you have not seen any results, but I think a lot of discussion taken place, a lot of solutions have been proposed, and it's not very long in future that we will see a solution and the power industry will bounce back to the kind of level that we have seen in the 11th plan or even more. I'm absolutely sanguine that in the next years to come, that power industry will grow, and this is one of the critical inputs which is required for the growth of the rest of the industry. And the propensity of consumption remains very high. Those people, those companies which have understood the need of India, I can tell you, they have done exceedingly well in India. Let me give you an example of foreign companies investing in India, which have been a great success. Many of you would have heard is about the automobile industry. If you look at the four-wheel, the vehicles which are there in India today, 80% market is held by the foreign companies. And right behind that stands the automotive component industry, which also has grown, and this is once again very much dominated by the foreign companies, both from Asia as well as from Europe. So I feel that the industry segment in India is set to grow, and Asia have a rare opportunity to position itself very robustly within the manufacturing sector, and therefore this creates a big window of opportunity between India and Asia to collaborate. China has already positioned itself very strongly within the manufacturing sector, and there's no reason why India should not do it. There's one more area which is very critical, and there's a lot of room for cooperation between the countries here in Asia, and that's the mining sector. Many countries have, they have surplus minerals which can be made use by other countries, but they have not been fully exploited. We haven't established norms. There's still some amount of anxiety as to if we start the trade, how would be the continuity in policy. So I think there are certain issues here within the ASEAN region or within the Asian countries. If we address them properly, I'm sure we'll create many more opportunities to increase the trade. It was mentioned in a minute earlier here that the total trade with ASEAN itself is about $80 billion. And this certainly can, double up to $150, $160 billion within the space of the next 7 to 8 years if we open more sectors. I want to give you an example of Korea. The Korean companies today dominate the consumer electronics segment in India, but they came to India, they knew what the Indian, the clients required, they positioned their products, and they worked with patience. I think this is one thing which is very important when you come to India, that you understand the local situation and you stay patient. Then you can end up becoming a Samsung, you can end up becoming an LG, which is the case today.
Robbie, I think that's again, you've just echoed what the previous speaker did in terms of being very bullish on what India offers to Asia. I'm going to now turn back to Dr. Ragurajan. Firstly, congratulations once again on being honored today morning. In many ways, I still remember when you took on your new role, it was the intellectual applause around it was second to none. I think matching when the finance minister took his role as well. So in your speech today morning, where you spoke about the 10 to 11% potential growth rate, frankly, is something which is being echoed as well on this panel. Now, here is the dilemma, and I'd like your thoughts as well on that, Raghu. At one end, India is a fantastic market for many global companies. Now, whether you talk to Standard Chartered or DBS on this table, or Deutsche Bank, for which it's our 5th largest market globally, or frankly, many of our other colleagues are out here. And equally, I still remember meeting an infrastructure company in Asia who defined INDIA as I'll never do it again, right? So frankly, you can see it from both prisms. As you sit at the nerve center, and how do you see the government taking on the opportunity, whether it's the trade corridor, the capital corridor, the FDI corridor, or frankly, even the political corridor of building Asia and India as one big region?
Well, first, thanks very much, and I'm deeply humbled by the award this morning. But I think just getting back to the panel, the issue of, I mean, there are two sides to India, and we should not minimize the fact that investors in India express tremendous amounts of frustration. I'm talking about real investors with permissions, clearances, etc. And I think, as Ravi just said, and as I was also trying to argue in the speech, I mean, India is undergoing teething problems. We've accelerated in a way that we weren't prepared for, and you know, we no doubt had a notoriously inefficient bureaucracy in the past. Some of that is changing. But also the rules and processes have to change, and we're in the process of doing that. So there is a think of this as a period when India is getting its mojo back, if you want to use a colloquial term, and that if we can do it right, it creates the conditions for much more sustainable and long-term growth. Just think why we are underperforming in manufacturing, for example. Power, not great. Roads, not great. Ports, airports, I mean, these are precisely the things we're working on. And again, when you look at power, for example, the number of power projects that were started during the 11th plan that are, some of them started even early in the 12th plan, coming on board now. And if we can get them the coal linkages, get them the gas linkages, we actually have certain areas of plentiful power for a little while. But certainly some of the deep shortages will be alleviated. Similarly, if we make the link to the grid to the southern region, again, some of the shortages will be alleviated. So there are fixes which are on the anvil. We got to accelerate them, no doubt. But if you add infrastructure to we have to, I saw a question on regulation, we have to work on regulation. We have to cut down the regulation, especially the small and medium phase, but even for the large ones. Are there some places where we can do self-regulation, some places where we can do third-party regulation? Does it all have to go to the government ministry? We need to think very clearly, very carefully about those things, and there are efforts underway. But regulation, infrastructure, and the last, which is the untouchable so far, labor. Can we fix something on the labor laws? In fact, these new industrial manufacturing zones have a ameliorated labor law, and that could be the way, the interim position, which creates a much more flexible but protected labor force in India. So, to my mind, the next 10 years will be very interesting in India. I'm not saying it'll be without hiccup, but it will be something that we can see the glimmering of. As we've heard from Ashwin, from Akhil, and from Ravi, this is a real possibility. Let me just end, because I know we're short of time. With on the trade side, India certainly has been thinking about looking east for the last so many years, but accelerated by the crisis. But India is also in a good position to look a little west, the Middle East, Africa, very close to us, and we could be because we have good relationships in both areas, we could be the intermediate point there. End with financial sector. India is going to absorb enormous amounts of capital over the next few years. So we have to create the conditions for that. First, we have to de-risk that investment on the real side, and no doubt all the questions people have on infrastructure investing, we have to deal with that. But if we can de-risk that investment, where else in the world do you have such massive needs for investment? Africa, perhaps, China is reaching the end of that. India still has major infrastructure investments. When you think of aging populations in the West, aging population in Japan, where are they going to put their money for long-term investment? India affords that possibility. We need to work on the financial sector, not just in the regulation, the basic technological infrastructure, but the physical infrastructure. We need people that are here to be able to go willingly back and forth between India and Singapore and live in cities in India. We need to have more attractive physical infrastructure, better schools for kids, better opportunities for significant others. Those are things we need to focus on. But I think, we will get there.
So the last question, if I may ask you again, because it comes right to the corridors of Delhi. I remember when President Obama got re-elected, I think his first trip, I could be wrong, but if I remember right, his first trip was into the ASEAN time zone, right? And he came into 3 countries in this region. And while we've seen the finance minister in Tokyo and we've seen him recently in Singapore as well, is looking east a priority of the government, or do you think corporate enterprise needs to take leadership on that?
No, I think both are united. I think there is no doubt that the attention of the government is focused on the growing weight of Asia and our need to engage, not just in the successful parts of Asia, but in the emerging Asia, our neighbors, but also Myanmar, for example, Cambodia, Vietnam. I mean, those are also places that we could engage in. Think about building out roads from the northeast in India, from sort of the center through Bangladesh to the northeast into the rest of ASEAN. I mean, how strong a center of how much economic activity will that generate? We need to do that. We need to do that on an accelerated basis. Those are the kinds of dialogues that certainly the government is starting to think of, and you will hear more of it in the years to come.
Thanks so much. I think we are at the end of allotted time. So thank you once again to all the panelists. Are there any audience questions, or we don't want to overrun our time?
Great, there you have it. And would you like to pick one? Perhaps the first one, or the second? 7 votes for, should India be more aggressive in making inroads into the Chinese market, and how can it do that?
Anyone wants to pick a? Please, Ravi.
Well, it's just a little bit based on personal experience of trying to come into China. That, of course, was based on multinational experience. Chinese market, is a highly segmented market. Especially I'm talking about the manufactured goods. You have brands which are comparable with the best of the world, and then you have, a very wide range of brands which are very low quality, heavily overcrowded. So, any country, country which has to come in, it has to decide which segment it wants to position itself in. And the top segments are basically very technology driven, and one has to have that kind of position in terms of brand if you want to get into that segment. In China, once again, there are a lot of niches which are available, where one can come in and generate value. And I know cases of many companies which have come in there and operated in niches, and they made a great success for themselves. So I think that's for the manufacturing sector. And one thing is there, that in China, they still have the policy of buy China only. And unless you're absolutely super premium brand from Europe and US or Japan, you start with some amount of disadvantage. So you really have to position yourself very well and endure a lot of pain that you can go through before you really get accepted there.
I mean, I tell you, my only comment on that would be you can't Google Earth on China. You got to be in China if you really want to monetize that market. But one advice to every Indian entrepreneur, which I would give, is open an office in China, not just for trade, not just as a consumption market, but as the provider of the $1 trillion of capital which India needs. So whether it's the CICs or ICBCs or ABCs or Bank of China's, I think they could very well be very long-term providers of capital to India.
Excellent. We'll bring that to an end. A big round of applause for our wonderful panelists. Very stimulating session there. Now we've got a gift for all the panelists. So at this stage, I'd like to invite up onto the stage Mr. Girija Pandey to give out these gifts for all of you. And a little bit about the speaker gifts today. They are all from Protsahan, which is an NGO that supports women from the Indian slums as well as disadvantaged children. Dr. Rajan will need you on stage for just a bit more. At this stage, I would like to invite Mr. R. Sukumar, the editor of Mint and Mint Asia, for the unveiling of Mint. I would also like to invite the Indian High Commissioner, Mr. T.C. Raghavan, for this unveiling.
I'd like to thank the Impact team for facilitating this unveiling of Mint Asia. In many ways, the IIMs are a global brand, one of the earliest Indian global brands and a very successful global brand. And I'm very happy that we are unveiling the first edition of Mint Asia here. It's also very fortuitous that this is happening in Singapore, which in many ways can be a role model for India in terms of discipline, in terms of governance, issues that India needs to focus on. We launched Mint in India around 6 years ago to be a fair and clear-minded chronicler of the Indian dream. It still remains the Indian dream. We are all very bullish on India in the long term, right? We are all very long on India in the long term, although our writing might seem to suggest that we are extremely short on it in the short term. And I think we are getting there. You know, I think Dr. Rajan put it well. I think eventually, if I were to sum up his speech this morning, I think the theme for it would be, eventually we shall prevail, and I think that's what will happen. I'd now like to ask Dr. Rajan and the Indian High Commissioner to unveil the first edition of Mint Asia. If you haven't subscribed to it already, please do. Thank you.
All I'd like to say is congratulations to Mint. It's an excellent, excellent newspaper, and I learn a lot from reading it, and I hope now your much wider audience will get a chance to see the intellectual journalism at work in India. So good luck, and again, congratulations on the new edition.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. And I think we had a very stimulating morning. But before I announce the coffee break, I would like to announce the sponsors for this event. And let me start with the platinum sponsors, that is DBS Bank, Standard Chartered, Temasek Holdings, the gold sponsor, Reddington, strategic partners, the EDB and Contact Singapore, knowledge partner, the SMU, lifestyle partner, LVMH, silver sponsors are BSI Bank Singapore, Jebsen and Jessen Offshore, Clearpac Singapore, First Capital Insurance, the associate sponsor, Mint Asia, preferred card, MasterCard, and enhanced table sponsors, ANZ, and table sponsors, Tata Communications, Polaris Financial Technology, QTech Group, MDIS, Deutsche Bank, CS Offshore, Industrial Australian Maritime, JOS Offshore, and Simmel International and Mark Plan. A big round of applause as well for all our sponsors for making all of this possible. I'll see you after the coffee break.